Hey, folks, and welcome to Typology, the show on which we explore the mystery of the human adventure and the human experience, all through the lens of the Enneagram. My name is Anthony Skinner, your producer and co-host. So happy to have you here. Today, we have such a special show for you with a very special guest. Enneagram 6, Wing 5, has written this really profound book, Resilient and Redeemed, Lessons about Suicidality and Depression from the Psych Ward. I'm talking about author Chris Morris. He is a mental health coach, and he has dedicated his life to promoting understanding of mental health issues within the church. So happy and thankful to have him on. He comes bringing the heat today and bringing the love. What a gentle, precious heart. I think you're just going to love this interview and love Chris. You're going to want to go out and get that book. Make sure you go ahead and pull the trigger on that, Resilient and Redeemed by Chris Morris. So that's it for me, Anthony Skinner. I'm happy that you're here. And without any further ado, here is the host of the show, Ian Cron.
Typology Tribe, join me in welcoming Chris Morris, author of the book Resilient and Redeemed, Lessons about Suicidality and Depression from the Psych Ward. He's an Enneagram 6. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, man.
Well, listen, this title is one of those titles that will throw you back on your heels.
Yes.
Okay? Resilient and Redeemed, Lessons about Suicidality and Depression from the Psych Ward. We're going to be getting into that in depth, and I just know it's going to be a really, really provocative and stirring conversation. But first, I want to talk about being an Enneagram 6. We haven't had a 6 on the show in quite some time, and people hear me say this all the time, but I'm a real fan of 6s. And I want to know about your experience as a 6, how you discovered your type, and what the realization that you were a 6 meant to you.
Sure. So I was mentioning this to you off air. I have a friend who is a bit of an Enneagram snob, and she had typed me as a 6 and sent me a test to take because she wanted to have a detailed conversation with me about what it was like being a 6. And she needed me to understand what that meant.
Right.
So I think it was off the Enneagram Institute. I took an Enneagram test there, showed up as a 6 Wing 5. And it was really fascinating to see the way that security plays such a huge role in my life. And I didn't appreciate, like I've done the MBTI, 100 other personality tests, but the Enneagram is really distinctly different. And it really highlighted a ton of things for me, both when I'm in my healthier states and when I'm in a non-healthy state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the theme of safety, security, and also another big one for 6s is certitude, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having a sense of certainty. And so how do you think being a 6 form or your approach to relationships, to life, to work, all those things?
Yeah, so let's start with relationships. I am really slow to trust people. And I think that isn't really about the other people. That's about me wanting to protect myself and to keep myself from getting hurt. Mm-hmm. Because sort of the flip side of security is the fear of being without support or without guidance or being rejected.
Right.
I have a fair bit of trauma in my life where from growing up, so I'm pretty familiar with being without the support and guidance that you want to have. Mm-hmm. And so I find myself really slow to trust people. But on the flip side, once someone's in my inner circle, it's ride or die time. I'm with them forever. It's really, really hard for someone to, it's almost like an apology. Well, you're one of my close friends. I'm sorry. That's never going to change. Hope you signed up for that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, you are called the loyalist. And,
right.
and also Well, and also, I think in the road back to you, I have a line in there. I said, when a six says "I do," they really mean it.
Wow.
Yes.
Like it's "I do" for life.
And it's funny because, I remember reading that and thinking I had that exact conversation with my wife. We were 20 and 21. So we weren't even fully formed adults yet. Didn't know what we were going to be when we grew up, when we got married. But I said to her, I need you to understand divorce isn't going to be a word that we use in this relationship. And she's like, no, of course, nobody really does. I'm like, no, 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 no. You're not getting it. This can't happen.
Well, I mean, that certainly is the sentiment that a six brings into relationships,
Yeah.
You mentioned the word certainty. Like, what's your relationship like with authority figures? So that could be pastors, politicians, anyone that's an authority figure in your life. Usually sixes have kind of an ambivalent relationship with authority figures. It's that vacillates between trust and distrust. Have you noticed that in yourself?
Yeah, I think the way I'd say it, Ian, is like this. I don't grant someone trust because of positional authority. They have to earn it with me personally in some
Mm-hmm.
way for that authority to matter in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've been in churches, not for very long, but I've been in churches where like the pastor just, I didn't trust him for whatever reason. So we had to bail because I can't be in a situation where someone who ought to have authority over me isn't earning that authority.
Mm.
That's created some challenges for me at work because positional authority is the name of the game.
Right.
You can't say to your boss, well, you haven't earned my trust yet. He's like, I don't
Right.
care. I'm your boss.
Right.
Right. Right. So, do you naturally, when you meet somebody in positions of authority, immediately, almost reflexively begin to scan and look for reasons not to trust them? Or are you somebody who's just, it doesn't sound like you're naturally trusting out of the box.
I wish I was, man. My life would be so much easier.
Right.
I am always looking for a reason to discount someone's place of authority or
Mm-hmm.
discount someone as a trustworthy person. I wish that wasn't the case. Like I said,
Mm.
my life would be easier if that wasn't the case, but this is who I am.
Yeah. So it's so interesting because that's a very six quality, right? Like sixes are just sort of naturally, like, for example, when I'm doing workshops, oftentimes I can spot certain types by their body posture,
Mm.
right? And, sometimes eights and sixes will start the day off with their arms crossed and their legs crossed. And they're kind of, sixes, sometimes their heads bob to the side a little bit and they're kind of watching me because for that day, right, I'm the authority in the room, right? I'm the guy who knows the Enneagram and I'm going to be teaching it all day long. And in the beginning, they kind of look at you like, all right, are you trying to pull the wool over our eyes here? What are you trying to sell? Are you going to try and upsell me to something else that you do? Is this stuff, what is the Enneagram? I don't know. Does my boss want this information about me for reasons I don't really want to talk about? You know what I mean? Do they
Yes.
want to know my type? Does that resonate with you at all?
Oh, 100%. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm, by the way, interestingly enough, I'm kind of the opposite. Like I actually trust people too quickly.
Mm.
And I've paid a price for that before, professionally, so it's just funny how different types like view other people. And I would imagine that sixes have this sort of feeling like you are a potential threat. Therefore, I have to be very careful about how quickly I align myself with you or ingratiate myself. You know where I'm going?
I do. I do. I've got a question for you. I've been wondering about this for a while.
Mm.
I can sort of trace my security orientation to some bad situations that I experienced as a child and in young adulthood. Do you feel like enneagrams are to a lesser or greater degree a function of or can be influenced by trauma?
Absolutely. So when we talk about personality, the question of nature nurture almost always comes up, right? Was I born this way? Was I formed this way? Was it family, culture? Was it genes? What was it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly don't know how to answer that question with any kind of like certainty, right? Like, in other words, the answer is yes. Like all of those things come into play. Now, the question is, in what direction is it weighted? Is it more genes? Is it more culture? Is it more trauma? Is it more this, right? And I think that's just a mystery. And I think it may be different for everybody. Like I look at my kids and I'm like, man, when that kid came out, they were an 8. Like I knew, like that kid was an 8 in the womb. You know what I mean? And then others, I think, the forces come into play that it takes longer. So again, I don't really know how to have a better, more honest answer than to say, I think that the formation of a personality is very complex, but certainly trauma plays a big part in it. In fact, there are some Enneagram teachers who would say that your Enneagram type is a response to trauma in some ways, right? Like
Interesting. Okay.
it is a set of adaptive strategies that helps you navigate the world as the result of trauma and your interpretation of what happens to you, right? The story you devise in response to things that happen to you. So let's say, as you've mentioned, you've had trauma in your childhood, significant trauma, right? Well, I suppose we could say, well, of course, it makes sense then that you, as a 6, developed a 6 story to interpret those experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And another person may have come up with a 4 story or a 2 story or a 1 story. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
I don't know how that happens. I just know that something happens, and then here we are, right? And then so again, I always approach the topic of personality with a kind of like, I sometimes feel like I'm treading where angels fear to go. You know what I mean? Like it's like, wow, this is very complicated. And so part of me is always a little agnostic about, about the topic, just to
Mm-hmm.
say it's incredibly complicated how people become who they are. But certainly trauma will play a significant role, particularly if it's unprocessed trauma, undigested, still out there, governing life from the shadows.
Thank you for taking the time to answer that. I've always wanted to ask someone who's an expert on one of these tests that
Mm,
question.
yeah. No, my pleasure. So, how do you think the traits of a 6, like the seeking of security, of certainty, of sometimes looking to relationships with others to provide a sense of safety and security, how is it intersected, do you think, with your own mental health journey?
Yeah. So I had sort of a life changing moment in 2020. I had a suicide attempt. Prior to that, I was, I sort of came to the recognition in the psych ward, I guess you could say, that, well, this is going to happen again unless everything changes. So I
Mm,
did some real self examination of what wasn't working in my life, why it wasn't working, and what practical things I needed to change to move into a healthier space. And suspicion of other people had really put me into a space where I was almost entirely isolated.
mm,
And I know that is, that this is sort of the story of unhealthy 6s. We don't trust anyone, so we isolate because we're the only ones we can trust. And I learned, after my suicide attempt that, well, if there's one person I can't trust to be in an isolated situation, it's Chris. So let's adjust that.
mm,
So then it was this process of me having to kind of I identified 3 or 4 people that I thought that maybe I could trust more, and slowly like extending trust out just a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And now I'm blessed where I have those 3 or 4 people where, I know that they are 100% for me no matter what, and that they're going to support me in whatever, even if I make a stupid decision, they'll probably tell me that it was stupid and tell me how to, that they're still for me, even though it was a dumb choice. And they might have some advice on how to not make such a dumb choice next time. But there won't be any sense of judgment, because everyone who's in that inner circle for me, they get how distraught and how challenging it is for me to have someone come at me aggressively and say, hey, this thing that you're doing isn't working. Yeah.
So you just mentioned that you have a group of relationships with people that are there for you no matter what. What do you need to see in somebody to place that kind of trust in them?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I'd start by saying it's definitely a process. It usually starts really small, like someone, just small talk. How are you doing today? And I'll go, it's been kind of a rough day. And the very beginning stages of me beginning to trust someone is when they lean forward, when I say something like that and go, well, what's made it rough? Is there any, or just expressing interest, rather than going, oh no. Because sometimes there's a certain type of person or anyone, if you're busy, we all have those moments, even the best of us. We have those moments where we're self-absorbed and we go, hey, how you doing? You don't really have time for a conversation because you're going from point A to point B. And if someone says, well, I'm not doing too good, internally you kind of go, oh crap, I don't have time for this. And so if I don't have someone respond like that's sort of the first step. And then it's a matter of me kind of slowly unraveling some of the things that I've experienced in my life, some of the struggles that I've had in my life, some of the peculiarities about my personality, and just observing how someone responds to that. And I can gauge based off of those responses if I feel like I can trust them to be tender with me, if that's maybe the right way to say it. Because it's still not natural for me to self-disclose.
So what's so interesting, Chris, is, sixes typically don't necessarily, in some cases anyway, like the spotlight of attention being placed on them for too long. And part of that is like, so for example, at work, a six, everyone likes to hear you did a good job, right? But they don't want to hear it for too long or have too big a spotlight put on them, because when you're in the spotlight, what are you? You're exposed, right? And there's a kind of feeling of not being safe, right? If the light's on me too long, then I become more of an illuminated target, right? And that can become problematic. And yet, here you've written a book, right, titled "Resilient and Redeemed: Lessons about Suicidality and Depression from the Psych Ward." This is clearly a very vulnerable, open, out there book, putting a spotlight on something super vulnerable. How did that feel? Did that feel natural to you?
Yeah, it was. It was a really scary book for me to write, and we initially pitched an entirely different book where I was able to keep my expert hat on, and then Bethany House came back and said, "Well, we like your writing, but we'd like you to write this instead." And I really had to sit with it for a while, which is funny. Usually as a writer, a publisher says, we like your writing. We want you to do this. What's the answer? Yes. Okay. Instead I had to really kind of sit with it.
Right.
Do I want to relay all the details, kind of the blow by blow accounts of the hard times that I've had, because it is very vulnerable. I realized that sort of the tipping point for me as I was starting to write it, after I had decided, well, we'll see how this goes. That's probably not the best way to move forward with the book contract. We'll see how this goes. But that was the decision I made. As I was writing it and I was sharing snippets of it with people, even people that I didn't necessarily think it would be directly applicable to, they were finding encouragement and strength and hope from the way that I approached the stories that I was telling, and how I was able to find God in all the darkness and the crevices that I experienced in my life. So I was able to get almost a divine image, if you will, of the work that the book was going to do. And that
Yes.
made it worth the risk for me.
I love that. So you mentioned earlier about your childhood, and I want to get to a lot of questions, and I don't want to shortchange it, but give us if you can, a précis of what your childhood was like, and at what point did you realize that you were struggling with some mental health conditions?
Sure. So the quickest way to describe my childhood, my dad was an emotionally and physically abusive alcoholic. I was raised in an a-religious environment. If you're interested in God, go figure him out. We don't have anything to offer you. And my introduction to faith actually came at a really prominent crisis point in my life because of a series of things I won't go into. I go into it in the book, but I don't. It's like a 20-page thing.
Sure.
I'm not going to do that here. I had gotten to a point where I basically prayed this prayer you probably should never pray to God. Hey, God, I don't know if you're real or not, but you've got 7 days or I'm going to kill myself. It was that kind of prayer.
Mm.
And then so in the midst of that crisis, God met me in a real profound, deep, illuminating, meaningful way to sort of stay that moment of suicidality. But the challenging part with that is, a lot of folks like to say, well, if you just draw close to Jesus, then your mental health problems are going to go away. And I was hearing that from people, but that wasn't my experience because I was continuing. So I was about 15 years old when I had that significant suicidal moment. And I've struggled with major depressive disorder and suicidality since then.
I think it's really important for people to know, that these conditions, are more serious and more prevalent than they realize, right? That many people carry these burdens in silence,
Yes.
that to come out and write a book and to speak about it is incredibly brave. And I just want you to hear me say and I do think that to share one's own journey with others at this level is remarkably courageous and I think it's particularly true for a 6.
Yeah, it was difficult for me as a 6 to make that decision to expose myself.
Mm-hmm.
And in the week the book came out in June is one of the worst mental health weeks I've had in a very long time. I was catastrophizing things like, oh, my book is going to garner attention for all the wrong reasons. I'm going to be review bombed. People are going to say, how does this guy even claim to be a Christian? Pastors are going to come out and say, never read this book. All these things that I was anticipating and it was like an exposure, a late exposure withdrawal response, if you will, to having the book published. It was like a what have I done moment.
Oh, yeah. Well, I can tell you that every author feels that way. maybe not with the complication of mental health stuff happening at the same time, but I can imagine then you add on that being a 6 and add on to it, and I don't know if it's a daily struggle with major depressive disorder or not, but you add all that on and it just is like just an accelerant.
Yes.
Thrown on the fire.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp Online Therapy.
Some people move into the holidays full of excitement and joy. Like, my favorite part of the holidays is busting out my warm, fleecy pants, drinking cinnamon tea by the fire with my dogs in the morning. It keeps me happy and cozy at home and helps keep struggles at bay. But for others, navigating the holidays can be a challenge. As we head into the winter months, it's important to remember that seasonal changes can affect us in more profound ways than we might realize. Therapy is a great way to bring yourself some comfort that never goes away, even when the seasons change. Whether you're trying to keep the peace at Christmas dinner or need some gentle guidance to lift your spirit, therapists are trained to help you figure out the cause of challenging emotions and learn productive coping skills, which makes therapy the closest thing to a guided tour of the complex engine called you. So, if you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, affordable, and entirely online therapy designed to be suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. If things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Find comfort this December with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/typologypodcast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/typologypodcast. So tell me about the intersection of faith and mental health. Like what's that journey like?
So I think a lot of it for me has come down to kind of identifying and defunding the influence of some myths that churches, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, teach about mental health. I already mentioned one of the ones that I had to struggle with, which is, if you would just get a little more mature, your mental health problem would go away. Another sort of related one is this idea that mental health is only a spiritual problem. So we read verses like out of Philippians chapter 4, be anxious for nothing, but in prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God. And people, because they're looking for A plus B equals C type equations in their faith, look at this and go, oh, you don't need to be anxious. Just pray. Everything will be fine. And, the reality is that isn't how general anxiety works. You can't just pray it away. So I do a lot of work around, like I said, defunding the influence of those types of myths. And most of this is stuff that I've had to figure out on my own. It's been a challenge to find other people to act as guides. So part of God's call on my life in this season, at least, is to be one of those guides, to help people on a regular basis work through the faulty theological beliefs that are influencing their mental health in a negative way.
And what are some of the other myths? Feel free to just expound on that.
Sure. Real Christians don't need psychotherapeutic meds. That's a huge one. You're trusting in medicine rather than God is sort of the expansion of that. And sort of the contradiction to that. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talks about how rain falls on the just and the unjust. Theologians expand on that idea, calling it the concept of common graces, things that God makes available to you regardless of whether you're a good little Christian or not. And I would say that I'm comfortable saying that medication and any number of other things fall into that area of common graces. These are things that are made available to us that we need to choose to, that we need to make a conscious decision about.
Yes. You're just bringing to mind a story. Years ago, I had a client and they had come from a very strict kind of fundamentalist Christian background. Now, I do not, right? I mean, I'm an Episcopalian. I'm about as far from fundamentalist as you get your hands on. But it was very, very clear that this person was struggling with bipolar disorder. And we worked together with a psychiatrist and began a course of treatment using lithium and then an anticonvulsant called Lamictal. And he was so medication resistant for the reason you're just saying, right? So finally, one day I said to him, look, Here's what I want you to do. Every morning when you take your medication out of the bottle, I want you to look at it and I want you to see it like it's the Eucharist.
Mm.
And realizing that the prayers of millions of people who suffered this condition in years past when this was not available, all of their prayers are inside of that pill. And I want you to then take it and receive it as in the posture of like a great Thanksgiving moment at the Eucharist table, you know? And that made it easier for him to go, oh, like this is a gift from God, right? Like this is something that, you know, was not available to countless millions of people throughout history and now is. And it may not be the cure-all, you know, for what ails me. However, it will improve my life. And that was a big moment for him.
Ian, I'm going to steal that at some point. I'll give you credit, but I'm definitely stealing that story. I'm just letting you know.
Feel free. Feel free. As Richard Rohr likes to say, oh, no, it's true, so it's not mine.
Yes.
If it's true, it doesn't belong to me. So anyway, I hope that, I hope that's helpful somewhere. So in the introduction to the book, you say, I think it's an introduction, you write this: I no longer have the right to withhold information about my mental health. Talk to me about that.
Sure. So one of the things that I realized post 2020 is that I was internalizing all the worst fears and all the worst things that I was experiencing in my life. Even from my wife, we've been married coming up on 30 years now, pretty soon. You know, some people say their spouses are their best friend. That's really not the right phrase for me because I can't imagine my life without Barbara. That goes beyond friendship. But even with her, I was not being honest. And the end result of that was that everyone in my life was astonished that when I attempted to die by suicide. And I realized in that moment, I was doing I shouldn't say in that moment. One of the things I realized is that I was doing the very people that I value in my life the most a grave disservice by not being honest about where I'm at. Now, obviously, that's going to look different from one person to the next. You know, my daughter is a high functioning autistic. Intellectually, she's about 10 years old. I'm not going to have a real in-depth conversation with her about how my depressive episodes are on the upswing right now. But I might say to her, you know, Dad's really sad right now. If you could pray for me, that would be great. You know, it would look different for me talking to my wife or my 29-year-old who's had his own struggles with mental health. But I just feel like if I'm going to be the type of husband, the type of father, the type of friend that I long to be, then transparency is sort of the cost of admission. And a part of me hates that because I want to keep everything internalized. Because again, going back to my security as a 6, I'm constantly exposing myself.
Yes.
And it's very contradictory to the way that I naturally want to react. But this is a season God has me in. Hey, this is the cost of admission for the life that I want you to live.
And I would imagine that do you have a strong 5 wing?
Yes.
Yeah. And that would only complicate that isolating part of you even more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, and also feed that, you know, you have a very analytical mind to begin with as a 6. And then add on to that the 5 influence, right? It would seem to even deepen that even more, I would imagine, right?
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah. So what does the church need to know about suicide? You know, like what does it need to understand about mental health and suicide and depression that it doesn't currently understand?
Boy, I could talk about that for a long time. For starters, I would say we need to stop pretending that it's not an epidemic. I've talked with so many pastors that have said, well, I don't think anyone in my congregation is struggling. And they're just point in fact wrong.
Yeah.
And, statistics, there was a 2022 study done that said 53% of professing Christians have struggled with anxiety or depression in the last 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
Just doing math, it's almost absolutely impossible for a church of any size to not have someone who is struggling or has struggled. So that's the first thing that, let's just recognize that this is at an epidemic level and that there is a certain level of pastoral responsibility to coach people on the ways they can improve their mental health. That includes everything from, I don't think it's inappropriate for a pastor to do a series on mental health and talk about cognitive reframing, talk about sleep hygiene, talk about the benefits of exercise, and talk about spiritual renewal. I think all of those things are within the realm of pastoral oversight.
Yes.
But my experience has been with pastors that they have sort of one of two responses. Either they think that, like I already mentioned, every problem is a spiritual problem if it's a mental health problem. So the biblical counselor type person who scares me, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
We can't take a document, a series of documents that were written thousands of years ago and try and apply 21st century understanding of psychology and psychiatry to it. That's just unreasonable. Or they think, well, I don't know what to do at all, so I'm going to do nothing to pretend that there's no place for me, there's no space for me as a pastor to influence or be a positive role model when it comes to mental health. And I think both of those are errors on sort of the far ends of the spectrum.
Right. Right. So I can think of a few, but I want to ask you, can you point to a biblical figure who pretty clearly suffered with a mental health condition or a moment, and that perhaps we don't typically think of as being that?
Yeah, my favorite example is the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. He says something like this. I'm paraphrasing it. My circumstances have overwhelmed me. I didn't know if I was going to make it. As a matter of fact, I thought I was going to die. I trusted in God and he got me through it because he's the God of the resurrection. So if we pull out just the first half of what he said and think of that not as a biblical text, but as a text message from a friend, it takes on an entirely different context.
Oh, that's interesting.
Can you imagine getting a text from a friend that says, I'm overwhelmed by my circumstances and I don't think I'm going to make it through? Oh my goodness, talk about red flags. You're probably showing up with pizza. Hey, are you going to make it through the night? I don't know if you're going to be okay, friend. I'm here for you. And it's the Apostle Paul, sort of the second father of Christianity, that had this moment. Other examples include, there are several people that had suicidal moments. Elijah comes to mind. Right after his battle with the prophets of Baal, he sits down under a broom tree and says to God, just kill me now, I'm a failure. Sort of a sidebar to that, God responds by saying, take a nap and have some food, and then we'll talk about it in the morning. I think there's some wisdom in that. Sometimes, not to denigrate mental health crises, but sometimes a nap and some food really does help.
Yeah, that's true.
I think of Moses. True. Moses had a moment in Numbers chapter 11 where he was overcome with the responsibilities that were placed upon him to lead the people of Israel, and he was sick of their whining. And he says, God, if this is how you're going to treat me, why don't you just kill me?
Yeah.
And the common narrative with both the Moses and Elijah story that's super important is that God didn't take either of these men of God at their word. They both said, kill me now. And God didn't say, okay, because he could have done that. Instead, he led with gentleness, he led with grace, and he led with practical resolutions to the problems they were dealing with.
And was that your experience?
Yes. I had a moment in the psych ward. This is one of two moments that absolutely revolutionized the way that I view myself and the way that I view my relationship with God. This was about 3 days after I woke up in the psych ward after my attempt. And I had this stirring in my spirit that God wanted to say something to me. We were watching some cinematic masterpiece like Rambo 8 in the group room. So I had to leave because Sly Stallone and the Holy Spirit, I just didn't want a conflict.
Yeah, right.
So I went and sat in my room and just waited. And almost an audible whisper. It wasn't, but it was almost an audible voice. I heard the Holy Spirit say to me, Chris, I still love you. And I argued, like, you can't love me. Look at me. I'm 3 days out from a suicide attempt. My wife is pissed off at me. My kids probably want nothing to do with me. I don't even love me. You can't love me. And I was gearing up for an argument. Another sidebar, if we ever want to argue with God, that's not going to end well. We should stop.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine. I told a friend of mine once. I was a very young man. I said to him, I'm in an argument with God. I was being kind of like whatever. He goes, oh yeah, who's winning?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I had one of those moments, and I was ready to battle with God. And instead of engaging me in a battle, the Holy Spirit just whispered again, no, Chris, I still love you. And something shifted in the core of my being where I started to believe if the creator of the universe can look at me in literally my darkest moments and still see something worth loving, maybe I ought to be a little more gracious with myself.
We all suffer from a sense of spiritual homelessness, this feeling that we're not fully at home in the world. To cope with our painful feelings and traumas, we search for quick fixes that eventually become habitual, self-destructive behaviors that ultimately create more problems than they solve. But did you know that anyone, addicts and non-addicts, can benefit from working the 12 steps and find the freedom, joy, and intimacy with God that their heart longs for? Curious how? Well, don't wait. Pre-order your copy of The Fix today. You can even get a limited edition autographed copy at fixsignedbook.com. You just brought to mind, and I would encourage people to check it out. So Anthony and I have a good friend. His name is Josh Graves, and he's the pastor of Otter Creek Church in Nashville. And he is a great pastor. And he had a friend of ours, Lee Camp. And, Anthony, you're a friend of Lee's. Lee teaches ethics at Lipscomb. Mm-hmm. Very, very bright guy, PhD, Notre Dame, super, love this guy, right? And he gave a sermon in the last 12 months on depression, his own struggle with depression. And it's actually quite good. I loved it. And maybe because I know Lee so well, I found it very moving. And I also love Josh because he is the kind of pastor you're describing that you want. He is the guy who does do sermons on mental health, and he's just a great, great guy. And I just wanted to mention that before we go, because people could just go check out that sermon on depression. It's really solid. If it's not necessarily a sermon that is scientific or research based, it's just his own experience. And in many ways, that's the most powerful. Is that. So on that, in the book, you have this statement. You write, I believe the church should be on the forefront of establishing inventive, practical, and powerful ways to include those with mental health conditions in all aspects of a community. Much more than wheelchair ramps, the church is where the depressed can find a place. The anxious mom can lead a small group. The schizophrenic is loved unconditionally. Why don't churches already do that? Number one, right? And number two, how do they even make a baby step toward doing that?
I think the fundamental reason that churches don't do that is because they're afraid. They haven't done the work to understand the specific details, not only of the clinical condition, but of the people that have the clinical condition. Because one person that has major depressive disorder is going to look entirely different from the next person that has MDD. But there's a lot of fear. And that fear it comes from a good place of wanting to protect the flock. because they think, well, I can't have someone who's mentally unstable leading a small group, as an example. So there's a lot of fear wrapped up around that. In terms of baby steps toward that, I think it needs to start with having, you can't start from a place of letting the anxious mom lead a small group, because at some point word's going to, quote, get out that she has anxiety. And if you haven't done the work of helping your congregation understand what that actually looks like,
Right.
all you're doing is you're setting up this mom for a failure. So I think it starts with some church-wide discipleship on the place of emotions, the role of mental health and faith. There's a lot of different ways you can do either of those things. One of the things we did at my church is my pastor interviewed me, just asked me a bunch of questions, sort of gave me an open mic, but I was able to borrow the authority that he'd earned over the last 12 years as the senior pastor to share some of the things that I've shared with you guys, and a lot of other things as well. So that started the conversation around, well, what actually does it mean to have a mental health condition and to be a faithful Christian? I think that question needs to be answered. And sort of the precursor to that question that a lot of churches need to deal with is, can you be a faithful Christian and have a mental health condition? Obviously, I lean toward yes.
Yeah.
But a lot of churches need to start there and ask that question directly and answer it directly.
So what do you say to somebody, and this is something I'm going to ask you to educate our folks on. What do you say to somebody for whom suicide looks like the only or the best option?
I guess the first thing I would say is I've been there, and I know how appealing that is. And I understand that a lot of people say that suicide is a selfish option because you're only thinking of yourself. My experience with it was that my pain, my sorrow, and my overwhelm were so great. It would be the equivalent of having headphones on at a volume of 100 every moment of your day for hours on end. It was just impossible to deal. So I get that. And I just want to affirm that there are probably things in that person's life that makes sense for them to want to respond that way. And then what I would say is, in the midst of that, do your best to try and give space, even if it's just a quarter of an inch. Give space for God to speak some truth into your life around how he views you. There is so much self-hatred that is involved with and superimposed over suicidality in particular. The thoughts often sound like, my family would be better off without me. A good place to start to get a God's eye perspective on how God actually sees us is Psalm 139. David wrote that psalm from a kind of dark place. But if you read that psalm and read it, personalize it as if God is saying it to you, what will happen is you will hear things like, I have formed you in the womb. I know your thoughts before you think them. You have been loved from everlasting to everlasting. I am going before you, and I follow after you. There is a strength in that particular psalm that can speak peace to those of us who are on the precipice of great darkness.
And I do want to remind people that if you are struggling with thoughts of suicide, of self-harm, that my urge to you, in addition to reading that, is to seek help.
Yes,
Like it
of
is,
course.
it is obviously, and I know you would say that, Chris, that it is vital that you immediately begin to speak aloud the darkness that you are internalizing and experiencing, and to surrender yourself into the hands of people. And I mean surrender, not in the sense of anything else, except to say, to throw yourself into the care not only of God, but of some people who can really help you right away before
Agreed.
overwhelm feels irreversible. And to take a holistic approach to healing, meaning your physical life, whether that means taking psychotropic medication to help alleviate the symptoms of depression before you can sometimes get down into some of the roots of it. We need to relieve some of the symptoms that are happening, but also taking care physically. And you were mentioning things like sleep hygiene and eating correctly and exercise and hydration and making sure that you're ticking all the boxes. And then your emotional life, your mental life, your spiritual life, your environmental life, all these things are going to have to be reviewed and looked at. And as you talked about from your own story, right, like this is going to require a little bit of an overhaul here, right? Like in multiple domains of my life, right? Moving out of isolation into a more social atmosphere. And again, this stuff is so endemic. Loneliness is endemic. Depression is endemic. Anxiety is at peak heights now. But help is available. And as I often tell, where I spend the vast majority of my time is with people with addictions. And so my thing with them is to say, look, it gets better. It's like, I just say, it's going to get better, man. It's going to get better. And I really always believe that's true, So again, I'm talking with our friend, Chris Morris, and he is the author of this really important book, Resilient and Redeemed, Lessons About Suicidality and Depression from the Psych Ward. Chris, thank you so much for coming on and talking about being an Enneagram 6 and about your journey. I want to encourage people to get a hold of this book. You might think that you don't know anybody for whom this book has any application, but the answer is you do, but you just may not know it yet. It's an important and prophetic book, and I think it's something that everybody needs to take very seriously. How do people learn more about what you're doing, Chris?
Sure. My home base is my website, Chris Morris Writes with a W, chrismorriswrites.com.
Great.
And then I've got a Substack as well. It's Resilience and Redeemed.
Beautiful. Well, my friend, thank you for being on, and blessed Christmas and New Year to you. And Anthony.
Yeah. That was
always,
rich.
I love
man.
you. That rich.
Wow.
Man. Important stuff. So again, Chris, we commend you for your courage and also for your willingness to come on and share your experience, strength, and hope with the folks that are listening. And to you who are listening, particularly at this time of year, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, and may you have rest. Until next time.